It was a bitter, cold morning in the small town of Ravenwood, Ohio. The sun had barely risen over the quiet streets, and the usual hum of suburban life was slow to begin. But inside the grand house on Birchwood Drive, things were far from calm. Police cars lined the street, their lights flashing a chaotic red and blue that pierced through the early morning fog. Officers moved about in a hurry, their faces tense and serious, speaking in hushed tones as they came and went from the house. Detective Samantha Carter stood at the front gate, watching the scene unfold. She had been called in after a local judge's wife, Maria Hill, had been reported missing. Maria hadn't shown up for a meeting with her lawyer, and her absence quickly raised suspicions. As the wife of Judge Harold Hill, one of the most respected men in Ravenwood, Maria was well known. No one expected her to simply vanish without a trace. The 911 call that led to the discovery had been made by Harold himself. He told dispatch that Maria had gone out for a walk late the night before, but hadn't returned. He mentioned that it was unlike her to leave without saying anything, especially considering the cold weather. But something didn't sit right with Detective Carter. She had worked enough cases to know when things didn't add up, and Harold Hill's story was one of those cases. There was something off in his voice when he spoke. It was subtle. So subtle that if you weren't listening carefully, you would have missed it. But it was there. The detective knew she had to dig deeper. There was more to this than a missing person report. Inside the house, Samantha began her investigation. The front door creaked open with a chilling sound as she stepped inside. The house was immaculate. Too immaculate for someone who had reported their wife missing. The furniture was neatly arranged, the counters spotless, and there was a faint smell of lavender in the air. It seemed as though nothing was out of place except for the eerie silence that hung in the air. "Detective Carter, this way," called Officer Daniels, who was standing near the kitchen. He looked pale, his eyes wide with concern. He gestured toward the back door. Samantha followed him down the hallway, past the formal dining room, and toward a closed door at the far end of the house. It was the door to the basement. The officer hesitated before opening it. "We found something down there," he said. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She knew that finding something down there could mean anything from a hidden stash of drugs to something far darker. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the staircase that descended into the basement. There was an immediate coldness that hit her as she descended, the air thick and oppressive. At the bottom of the stairs, Samantha's eyes immediately locked onto a sight that would haunt her for weeks to come. Maria Hill's body sprawled out on the cold concrete floor, lifeless and still. But what was even more chilling was the fact that she had clearly been there for a while. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, and it appeared that Maria had been dead for at least a few days. But there was something else, something far stranger that made Samantha's stomach twist. The room around the body looked as though it had been lived in. Clothes were strewn across the floor, half-empty bottles of wine littered the countertops, and there were faint signs of activity. A life lived, but in complete isolation. Maria's body in the corner of the room almost looked as if it had been abandoned, left to rot while the life continued upstairs. A cold shiver ran down Samantha's spine. She turned to Officer Daniels. "What's going on here? How could no one have noticed?" "We don't know yet, Detective," Daniels replied, "but it looks like she was left here for some time." Samantha spent the next few hours piecing together the details of Maria's life. Interviews with friends, family, and colleagues revealed that she had been a vibrant, active woman. Nothing about her life suggested that she had been in danger. The Hills had been married for over 15 years, and while there had been whispers about Harold's private life, no one had ever guessed that things were anything but perfect between the couple. But as Samantha spoke to more people, she began to uncover small inconsistencies. Some of Maria's closest friends mentioned that she had recently become distant, withdrawn, almost as though she were hiding something. She had stopped attending social gatherings and had been spending more time alone. A few of them even mentioned that Maria had seemed unusually upset the night before her disappearance, though no one knew the reason. Samantha's gut told her that this wasn't just a case of a woman disappearing and leaving her family behind. There was something deeper, darker at play here. She began to focus on Harold Hill. Later that afternoon, Detective Carter made her way to the Ravenwood courthouse, where Harold Hill worked. She needed to speak with him in person. The more she learned, the more questions she had about the relationship between the judge and his wife, and Harold was the key to understanding it all. Inside his office, Harold Hill sat behind his desk, dressed in his judge's robes. He looked every bit the part, calm, collected, and confident. But there was a subtle tension in his eyes that made Samantha uncomfortable. He rose from his chair as she entered and extended his hand to greet her. "Detective, I don't know what to say. I'm just devastated," Harold said, his voice calm but laced with an undertone of something else, something that Samantha couldn't place. He looked tired, but then again, so did everyone in a situation like this. "I understand, Judge Hill. This must be incredibly difficult for you. I just need to ask you a few questions," Samantha said, taking a seat across from him. "Of course. Anything you need," Harold replied, a forced smile playing on his lips. His eyes darted briefly toward the window before meeting hers again. Samantha paused for a moment, studying him. "Can you tell me what happened the night your wife went missing? You said she went for a walk, but no one saw her. Do you have any idea where she might have gone?" Harold's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly composed himself. "I don't know, Detective. She said she wanted some fresh air, but when she didn't come back, I started to worry. I I thought maybe she had just needed some time alone. Maria has been under a lot of stress lately. You know how it is." Samantha studied him carefully. There was something in his voice, a slight tremor, that betrayed his calm demeanor. "What kind of stress?" she asked, her voice low and probing. Harold shifted in his chair. "I don't know. Maybe it's just the pressure of being married to a man in my position. She was always so supportive, but recently, she had been acting differently. I thought maybe it was just the stress of the holidays or the recent case she was working on at the law office." Samantha noted the way he stumbled over his words, the way he seemed to avoid answering directly. "Is there anything else you want to tell me, Judge Hill?" she asked, her tone harder now. Harold's eyes flicked to the door, then back to her. "No, no, Detective. I don't think so." As Samantha left the courthouse, she felt the weight of the case settle deeper on her shoulders. There was something off about Harold Hill, something he wasn't telling her. The more she dug, the more she realized that Maria's death was just the tip of the iceberg. Harold Hill had been hiding a secret that could explain why his wife was dead. The detective's mind raced as she pieced together what she knew. There was no way this was just a simple missing persons case. Harold Hill was hiding something darker, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Detective Samantha Carter couldn't shake the feeling that the more she learned about Judge Harold Hill, the more her instincts screamed that he was hiding something. The picture he painted for her was that of a grief-stricken husband. But something about the way he spoke, the subtle avoidance in his eyes, didn't align with the image of a man mourning the loss of his wife. The case was no longer a missing persons investigation. It had become a murder investigation. Maria Hill had been dead for days, possibly longer, and Harold's behavior suggested that he knew more than he was letting on. But what exactly was he hiding? Samantha spent the next few hours reviewing the case files and speaking to more of Maria's friends, family, and colleagues. She needed to understand what had driven the Hills' marriage to this tragic point. As she pored over the details, one piece of information stood out: Maria's increasing sense of unease in the months leading up to her death. She had been withdrawn, quieter than usual, but she hadn't shared any of her concerns with anyone, not even her closest friends. There were whispers of a rift in the marriage, one that had appeared out of nowhere. Friends of Maria noted that she had become paranoid and seemed to be pushing people away. It wasn't just the stress of the holidays or the pressure of Harold's career. There was something else, something deeper. And the deeper Samantha dug, the more convinced she became that Harold had something to do with it. That evening, Samantha sat at her desk, reviewing the photographs of the crime scene, trying to make sense of the disturbing image of Maria's decomposing body. The basement had been well kept, almost too well kept, and there was no sign of forced entry or struggle. Everything pointed to one conclusion: Maria had died at home, and Harold had been living with her corpse for an extended period of time. But why? The door to her office creaked open, breaking her concentration. She looked up to see Officer Daniel standing there, holding a manila folder in his hand. "Detective Carter," he said, walking in and placing the folder on her desk. "We got a report back from the forensics team. There's something you need to see." Samantha's pulse quickened as she flipped open the folder. Inside was a set of photographs of Maria's body, taken during the autopsy. There were no signs of physical trauma, but the cause of death had been listed as blunt force trauma to the head, likely caused by a heavy object, though the exact weapon was yet to be identified. However, what caught Samantha's attention were the additional details. There was a trace amount of sedatives in Maria's system, suggesting that she had been drugged before the fatal blow had been struck. "Drugged?" Samantha muttered under her breath. She looked up at Daniels. "That changes everything." "I thought you'd say that," Daniels replied. "There's more. We also found a partial print on the glass of a bottle of pills in the kitchen. It wasn't Maria's, and it wasn't Harold's either." Samantha's stomach churned as she processed this new information. Someone else was here. Someone else was involved. The next morning, Samantha returned to the Hills' home. She wasn't going to stop until she had the answers she needed. Her gut told her that Harold Hill wasn't the only person with secrets in this case. She carefully examined the kitchen once again. The half-empty bottle of pills sat innocuously on the counter, and the faint traces of a fingerprint on the glass seemed to taunt her. This wasn't a typical murder. This was calculated. Someone had planned Maria's death with chilling precision, and the fact that the fingerprints didn't belong to Harold meant only one thing. Someone else had been in the house with her. Someone who had access to the Hill home. Someone close enough to Maria to be trusted. Samantha's mind raced. It didn't take long before the answer came to her. Maria's best friend, the one person who had been close to her during the last few months, Rachel Whitmore. Rachel had been one of the few people Maria had confided in before her death. She had even mentioned feeling uneasy about Harold, but she'd never gone into detail. But something about the way Rachel spoke of Harold had seemed off to Samantha during their initial interview. Rachel had been quick to defend him, almost too quick. Could Rachel have been involved? Samantha wasted no time in tracking Rachel down. She found her at a local cafe, sitting alone at a corner table, a coffee cup in front of her. When Rachel saw the detective, she froze, her eyes widening. "Detective Carter," Rachel said, her voice wavering. What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you, Rachel," Samantha replied, her voice calm but firm. "About Maria." Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I've already told you everything I know, Detective." "Have you?" Samantha asked, sitting down across from her. "I'm afraid I don't believe you. You're hiding something." Rachel swallowed hard. "I'm not hiding anything, Detective. I told you that Maria had been distant lately. She was worried about Harold, but she wouldn't tell me why. She was scared." Samantha leaned in closer. "What was she scared of, Rachel?" Rachel's eyes flicked nervously toward the door, then back to Samantha. She took a deep breath. Maria had discovered something about Harold, something that he'd been keeping a secret for years. Samantha felt her heart skip a beat. "What secret?" Rachel hesitated before answering. "Harold isn't who he says he is. He's transgender. He's a man who loves other men." Samantha's mind raced as the pieces started to fall into place. This was the secret that had destroyed Maria in Harold's marriage. Maria had discovered Harold's hidden identity and couldn't accept it. The tension between them had likely reached a boiling point, leading to Maria's tragic death. But that wasn't all. Rachel continued speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maria had told me that she was going to confront him. She was going to tell everyone. She couldn't live with the lie anymore. Harold had been hiding his true self for years, and she was going to expose him." Samantha felt a chill crawl up her spine. This was the motive. Maria's discovery of Harold's secret had led to her death. Rachel's revelation left Samantha stunned. It explained so much: the tension in Maria's life, her withdrawal, and her ultimate fate. But it also raised new questions. Why had Harold gone to such extremes to protect his secret? Why had he killed Maria and lived with her corpse? Rachel's confession was the key to understanding the twisted dynamics in the Hill household. Harold's shame and fear had driven him to commit an unthinkable act to keep his secret hidden. But now, it was all unraveling. The truth was coming to light, and it was only a matter of time before Harold Hill would face the consequences of his actions. Samantha's mind was racing, and as she left the cafe, she knew that the investigation was far from over. The murder of Maria Hill was a tragedy born from fear, shame, and deceit, but now it was up to Samantha to bring justice for the victim and expose the dark truth that Harold Hill had been trying so desperately to conceal. Detective Samantha Carter sat in her car outside the Hill residence, her mind a whirlwind of questions and revelations. The truth about Harold Hill's secret, his transgender identity, and the forbidden love he had hidden for years, was slowly coming into focus. But while this newfound information had clarified the motive behind Maria's death, it didn't explain why Harold had been so meticulous in covering up the crime, or why he had chosen to live with his wife's corpse for days. Samantha's gut told her that the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The more she learned, the more she understood that Harold had orchestrated this entire ordeal like a twisted game of control. And now she had to pull on the threads of that web of deceit to uncover the full truth. As she sat in her car, she went over the details of her conversation with Rachel Whitmore again. Rachel had been Maria's confidant, the person she had trusted the most. But Samantha was cautious. She couldn't take Rachel's word at face value. There was something about Rachel's quick defense of Harold that still felt off. Could Rachel be hiding something too? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone ringing. It was Officer Daniels. Samantha quickly answered, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her mind. "Detective Carter, we've made another discovery," Daniels said, his voice tense. "You need to come back to the house, now." Samantha didn't waste a moment. She drove back to the Hill residence, her mind racing with a mix of anticipation and dread. What now? What new piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place? When she arrived, Daniels was waiting for her at the front door. His face was grim, his usual composure shaken. "We found something, Detective," he said, leading her inside. He handed her a manila folder, and she opened it immediately. Inside were more photographs, this time of a second room in the basement. The room had been hidden behind a false wall, and in the center of the room was a large, intricately carved wooden chest. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. This chest, this hiding place, looked far too deliberate to be accidental. "Go ahead," Daniel said, nodding toward the photos. "You need to see what's inside." Samantha's pulse quickened as she glanced through the photographs. The chest had been opened, and the contents revealed a chilling scene. Inside, there were several items: clothes, a man's suit, and a collection of photographs. But what caught Samantha's eye was the stack of letters. They were neatly organized, each one sealed with care. She could see that some of the letters had been written in a woman's handwriting, while others were clearly written by a man. "Do you think Harold was writing these letters?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniels nodded grimly. "We think so, Detective. We found a few that seemed to be from him, confessing his feelings, his desires. Some of them even have a signature. But there's one letter in particular that stood out." Samantha's eyes narrowed. She flipped through the stack of letters, each one more cryptic than the last. But there was one letter in the middle that seemed different. It was shorter than the others and written in a hurried, almost panicked hand. The message was clear but chilling. "I can't live this lie anymore. Maria's found out. She's going to ruin everything. I can't lose her, but I can't lose myself either. This is the only way." Samantha's blood ran cold. This letter, more than anything else she had uncovered, painted a clear picture of Harold Hill's desperation. Maria had discovered his secret, and he had gone to extreme lengths to ensure that his life and his carefully constructed facade remained intact. "What does this letter mean?" Samantha muttered, more to herself than to Daniels. "It means Harold was living a lie, and that lie came crashing down the night Maria found out the truth. But it also means Harold wasn't working alone," Daniels said, his voice low. "We need to look at these letters more closely. They might tell us more about the people involved in this." Samantha took the stack of letters to her office and began to read them one by one. Each letter revealed more about Harold's inner turmoil, his fear of being exposed, his hatred of the person he had become, and his inability to reconcile his true identity with the life he had built. But as she read further, something else began to emerge. The letters weren't just written by Harold. There was a second person involved, someone with whom Harold had been communicating in secret. She found one letter in particular that sent a shiver down her spine. It was dated just a few days before Maria's death, and it was addressed to Harold from an anonymous sender. The letter read, "I told you I'd help you, Harold, but you need to be ready. You've kept your secret long enough, but it's time for Maria to stop asking questions. She'll ruin everything for both of us. You know what you have to do." Samantha's eyes widened as she read the final words. "I'll be there for you when it's over." The implication was clear. Someone else had been involved in Maria's murder. Harold had a partner, a co-conspirator, who had helped him cover up his secret and, ultimately, silence Maria. But who was this person, and why had they chosen to help Harold? Samantha's mind raced as she pieced the puzzle together. She needed to dig deeper into Harold's personal life, beyond the letters, beyond his work as a judge. She needed to understand the people who were close to him, those who might have had the motive and opportunity to assist him in hiding his darkest secrets. Her next step was clear. She needed to speak to more people. People who might know Harold's past, his relationships, and any connections he might have had with people who could help him. Samantha decided to visit Harold's former colleagues from his time working at the local law firm before he became a judge. It was here, she believed, that the answers would lie. This was where Harold's old life had been rooted, before he had taken on the public persona of the respected judge. If there was anyone who knew him, it was his colleagues. The law firm was located in downtown Ravenwood, a short drive from the Hill residence. Samantha walked into the building, greeted by the receptionist, who directed her to the second floor. The offices were pristine, with polished hardwood floors and modern decor. She could tell immediately that this was a place of power, where deals were made and lives were changed. She was escorted to the office of Gerald Thomas, a former colleague of Harold's who had worked alongside him for years. Gerald was a tall man in his mid-50s with a sharp suit and an air of authority about him. When Samantha introduced herself, he looked taken aback but agreed to speak with her. "I'm afraid I don't have much to offer, Detective," Gerald said, sitting back in his leather chair. "Harold and I were colleagues for a while, but we haven't kept in touch since he became a judge. I haven't seen him in years." Samantha wasn't convinced. She leaned in slightly. "Was there anything unusual about Harold during the time you worked together? Anything that might hint at a secret life?" Gerald shifted uncomfortably. He seemed to be thinking hard, as though searching for the right words. "Well, now that you mention it," he said slowly, "there was something strange about him. There were rumors about his private life, whispers among the staff. But Harold always kept things tight-lipped. No one really knew much about his personal life, especially after he married Maria. He kept her at arm's length in many ways, always hiding behind that public persona of his." Samantha pressed further. "Do you think Harold could have had someone on the side? Someone who might have helped him with this?" Gerald paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "There was a man who worked with Harold on a few cases, a lawyer from out of state. I never got his name, but they seemed to have a close professional relationship. If anyone knew anything about Harold's private life, it might have been him." Samantha's eyes flashed. "Do you remember the man's name?" Gerald hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "David Burke. He was an outsider, very secretive, but he and Harold were quite close, and I've heard they kept in touch after Harold became a judge." David Burke. That was the name Samantha needed. As she left the law firm, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had a name, she had a lead, and she was one step closer to unraveling the web of deceit that had led to Maria Hill's tragic death. Detective Samantha Carter's mind was racing as she walked out of the law firm. Gerald Thomas's words about David Burke echoed in her head. Burke was a name she hadn't heard before, but it seemed to be the key that would unlock the final pieces of the mystery. She had already connected the dots between Harold Hill's secret life, his desperate attempt to keep his transgender identity hidden, and his wife Maria's tragic fate. But David Burke? That was a new lead, and it felt like the most important one yet. The name David Burke had an air of mystery to it. Samantha's instincts told her that he was not just some lawyer. There was something more here, something far more sinister. Burke had been close to Harold during his time as a practicing attorney, and now it seemed like he had somehow slipped into the background of Harold's life post-marriage. The fact that Gerald had mentioned Burke in relation to Harold's private life was enough for Samantha to take this lead seriously. Samantha's first step was to check if David Burke had any criminal history. She knew that the man was a lawyer, but she needed to dig deeper. She made a few calls to the department's research unit and pulled up a file on Burke. What she discovered gave her pause. David Burke was a name that had shown up a few times in legal cases, but not in the typical sense. He had been involved in some cases that had been sealed, almost as though someone with power had been protecting him. She dug deeper into the records, pushing through layers of bureaucracy until she found something that made her blood run cold. David Burke had once been accused of orchestrating a large-scale bribery scheme in a city not far from Ravenwood. The charges had been dropped mysteriously, but there were rumors about his involvement in illegal activities. Activities that weren't just limited to bribery, but also trafficking in sensitive information. This was not the kind of man someone like Harold Hill should have been associating with. Samantha's hunch had been right. Burke wasn't just some legal associate. He was connected to darker dealings, and Harold Hill had probably been involved in them too. She spent the next few days tracking down David Burke, but it wasn't easy. His whereabouts seemed to be hidden, as if he was deliberately trying to evade any attention. After an exhausting round of calls and inquiries, Samantha finally managed to track him down to a small apartment complex on the outskirts of Ravenwood. It wasn't much, just a nondescript building tucked away between rows of rundown stores. It screamed anonymity, a perfect place for someone trying to stay out of sight. Samantha approached the apartment cautiously. She knew that Burke could be dangerous. He was likely someone with connections to people who weren't afraid to use violence to protect their interests. But she wasn't going to back down. Not now, not when she was so close. She rang the doorbell, and after a moment, a man answered. He was tall, with dark hair and a sharp, almost predatory look in his eyes. He was wearing a loose shirt and jeans, as if he hadn't bothered to put much thought into his appearance. "Yes?" he asked, his voice smooth but with an edge that made Samantha's skin prickle. "Mr. David Burke?" Samantha asked, her badge visible in her hand. "Detective Samantha Carter. I need to ask you a few questions about Harold Hill." Burke's expression shifted slightly, though he quickly regained his composure. "Harold Hill?" he repeated. "Why would you be asking about him?" Samantha's instincts screamed that she was dealing with a man who was more involved in this case than he was letting on. "I have information that suggests you may have been connected to his personal life, perhaps in a way that goes beyond your professional dealings." Burke smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've had no contact with Harold for years." Samantha didn't believe him. She stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Burke, I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. We know you were involved in some shady dealings in the past, and I'm certain you have more information than you're letting on. I can make this easy, or I can make it hard, but you will talk to me." Burke studied her for a moment, then sighed heavily, as if resigning himself to the fact that he couldn't avoid the conversation. "Fine," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "But you're wasting your time, detective. I'm not involved in any murder, and neither is Harold." Samantha walked in, her eyes scanning the small, cluttered apartment. It was neat but lacked any warmth. There were no personal touches, no family photos, no memorabilia, just books, papers, and the distant hum of a fan. Burke gestured for her to sit, then took a chair across from her. "I'm going to be very clear, Mr. Burke," Samantha said, her tone sharp. "Harold Hill's wife, Maria, is dead. She was murdered in cold blood, and all signs point to Harold. But we know that someone helped him. Someone helped him cover up the murder, and that someone is you." Burke's eyes flickered with the slightest hint of surprise, but he quickly masked it. "That's absurd. I had nothing to do with her death." Samantha leaned in, her voice low. "You and Harold were close. You helped him with more than just legal matters. I'm sure you were aware of his secret life. You knew what was at stake for him, didn't you? He was terrified of Maria finding out, terrified of losing everything he had built." Burke didn't speak for a long moment. His fingers drummed on the armrest of his chair, a sign of anxiety that didn't match his calm exterior. "I don't know what you think you know, detective," he said finally, his voice a little too controlled. "But you're wrong. Harold is a grown man. He makes his own choices. I didn't force him to do anything." Samantha was getting closer. She could feel it. But you didn't stop him, did you? You knew exactly what he was capable of when he was pushed to his breaking point. And you probably helped him with the cover-up, didn't you? Burke's eyes hardened. You're barking up the wrong tree. Samantha wasn't deterred. She stood, fixing him with a cold, unflinching stare. You think you can hide behind that smug demeanor, Mr. Burke? We'll find out everything, every little detail. And when we do, you'll have a lot to answer for. As she left David Burke's apartment, Samantha felt a chill running down her spine. Burke wasn't the one who had pulled the trigger, but he was most definitely involved. He knew things about Harold Hill's past, about his secrets, that could bring down the entire case. And the more Samantha thought about it, the more she realized that Burke wasn't just a witness. He was a key player in the game Harold had been playing, and it was clear now that the path to uncovering the truth about Maria's death went straight through him. The rain came down in sheets, battering the windows of Detective Samantha Carter's car as she sat in the parking lot outside the Ravenwood Police Department. She'd spent the better part of the day chasing dead ends and talking to witnesses who didn't seem to know anything more than what they had told her initially. But as she sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, one thing was clear. David Burke was lying, and the truth was within her reach. It was just a matter of how far she was willing to go to uncover it. She had already learned a lot about Burke's connections to Harold Hill, but Samantha knew that this wasn't a case where the truth would just present itself. She needed something concrete, something irrefutable, that would link Burke to Maria's murder, something more than just circumstantial evidence and his shady past. She tapped the dashboard with her fingers, thinking about her next move. There was one place that might give her the answers she needed: the Hill family home. It was a long shot, but if Maria had discovered something in the days leading up to her death, it was likely written down somewhere. People didn't hide dark secrets without leaving a trail behind. And if Maria had been close to finding out about Harold's transgender identity, there was a chance she had documented it before everything went wrong. Samantha started the engine and drove off toward the Hill residence. She wasn't going to waste any more time. The clock was ticking, and if she didn't act quickly, Burke and Harold would find a way to cover their tracks. It was time to get to the bottom of this. The Hill residence was a large, imposing home on the outskirts of Ravenwood. It looked pristine from the outside, with manicured lawns and towering windows that reflected the dark and stormy sky. Samantha had been here before, a few days after Maria's death, but this time she was determined to find something they had missed. She rang the doorbell, and after a few moments, a man opened the door. He was tall, with a stern face that seemed to soften as he recognized her. It was Mark Hill, Harold's older brother, who had been in town during the investigation. He had been staying with Harold and Maria during the aftermath of the murder, but as far as Samantha knew, he wasn't involved in any way. Still, she needed to ask him a few questions. "Detective Carter," Mark greeted her. "What brings you here again?" "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Hill," Samantha said, showing her badge. "I need to ask you a few questions about your brother's relationship with his wife, Maria. There's something I believe we missed in our initial investigation, and I think you might be able to help." Mark frowned, clearly uneasy. "I've told you everything I know, Detective. I don't know anything more about what happened." "I understand," Samantha said, trying to keep her tone gentle. "But if you don't mind, I'd like to take a look around the house again. Maria's personal belongings, anything she might have left behind." Mark hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Go ahead. I don't think there's anything that will help you, but if you need to look around, you have my permission." Samantha stepped inside, her eyes immediately scanning the room. The house was well kept, with expensive furniture and framed family photos lining the walls. But something about it felt cold. The kind of cold that didn't come from the weather outside. She could tell that this house had been built to impress, but there were no signs of warmth, no evidence of a loving family. She followed Mark through the house, her eyes darting from room to room. They passed the living room, the kitchen, and finally stopped at the staircase that led to the second floor. Mark led her up to the hallway, where several doors lined the walls. "I'll show you Maria's study," he said. "It's the room where she spent most of her time." He opened the door to a small, cozy room that was clearly Maria's sanctuary. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a desk sat against the far wall, cluttered with papers. There were also several framed photos on the desk, photos of Maria and Harold, their wedding day, and one of them on vacation, laughing by the beach. It was an image of a happy couple, but Samantha knew now that the reality of their relationship was far from that. "Do you mind if I look through her things?" Samantha asked, her voice steady. Mark nodded, though his unease was palpable. "Go ahead, but like I said, I don't think you'll find anything helpful." Samantha ignored his discomfort and began sifting through the papers on Maria's desk. Most of it appeared to be work-related, correspondence, notes, and reminders. But then she found something that made her stop. It was a letter, typed on a computer, and printed out on the same high-quality paper that Maria had used for her personal correspondence. At the top, the letterhead read, "Hill Family Trust." Samantha recognized the name immediately. This was Harold's personal trust fund, the one he had worked so hard to keep secret. The letter itself was dated only a few days before Maria's death. She quickly skimmed the contents of the letter. It was a draft of a will, one that Maria had apparently been in the process of rewriting. In the letter, Maria addressed her desire to ensure that her children were taken care of in the event of her death. But there was a clause near the end that caught Samantha's attention. It read, "If my husband, Harold Hill, has kept any more secrets from me, if there are things in his past that he has deliberately hidden, then I request that all family assets be transferred to my children upon my death. I will not allow any more lies to destroy our family." Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. This letter was the smoking gun. It was clear that Maria had discovered something about Harold, something that he had been desperately trying to hide. The question now was what it was, and how far Harold was willing to go to protect his secret. Samantha folded the letter and slipped it into her jacket pocket. She needed to find out more, and fast. But this piece of evidence was a breakthrough. It was the key to unlocking the mystery of why Harold Hill had killed his wife. Later that night, Samantha sat in her office, staring at the letter in her hands. It was clear now that Harold had a lot more to lose than anyone had imagined. The pressure of keeping his secret, his transgender identity, had driven him to a point where he saw no other way out. Maria had found out, and she was going to expose him. That was why he had killed her. But why had he left the body in such a public way? Why had he not taken steps to cover it up more thoroughly? Samantha's mind raced as she pieced together the puzzle. There was still so much more to uncover, and she wasn't about to stop now. The truth was out there, and she was determined to find it. Samantha Carter couldn't shake the feeling that the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more twisted and disturbing than she had ever imagined. The letter from Maria had confirmed everything she suspected. Harold Hill had been hiding something major, something that had driven him to murder. But now that the letter was in her hands, she had more questions than answers. Why had Harold chosen to kill Maria in such a violent way? Why had he left the body at their home for days? And what role, if any, did David Burke play in all of this? The investigation had taken her to some dark places, but as she sat in her office, the weight of the truth was starting to settle in. The cold, sterile nature of the Hill family home had felt suffocating. It was a place that had once been a haven for Maria, but now it felt like a mausoleum, a testament to the lies that had ultimately torn it all apart. She needed to get back to Harold. He was the key to everything now. It wasn't just about Maria's death anymore. It was about the life Harold had tried so desperately to hide, and the murder he had committed to keep it buried. The next day, Samantha was back at the Ravenwood Police Department. She had spent the entire night reviewing the evidence, cross-checking everything from the Hill family's financial records to Harold's background. She had already uncovered a trail of lies that went back years, but now she needed to confront Harold. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was an alert from the lab. The results from the DNA samples taken from Maria's body had come in. She opened the message and her eyes narrowed. The results were shocking. The DNA matched. Not just any DNA, David Burke's. Samantha's pulse quickened. This was the break she needed. David Burke had been involved in this murder in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had suspected him for a while, but this new revelation confirmed it. He hadn't just been an accomplice. He had been there. He had been involved in the crime itself. Samantha stood up abruptly, her mind already moving through the next steps. She had to talk to David Burke. She had to bring him in for questioning, and she had to do it before he could disappear again. The storm from the night before had cleared, leaving a fresh, crisp morning in its wake. Samantha drove to David Burke's apartment once more, her hand gripping the steering wheel with determination. She had no intention of letting him slip away this time. When she arrived at the building, her eyes scanned the surroundings. Nothing had changed. It was the same quiet, nondescript apartment complex where she had confronted Burke earlier. But now she was here with evidence that tied him directly to the crime. He was no longer just a potential suspect. He was a criminal. Samantha made her way to the door, her steps deliberate. This was it. There would be no more games, no more lying. She rang the doorbell. Burke opened the door, his face expressionless. But when he saw her standing there, his eyes flickered with something, fear perhaps. It was brief, but it was enough for Samantha to know she had him. "Detective Carter," he said coolly. "Back again? What do you want now?" Samantha didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to talk to you about the murder of Maria Hill. And this time, we're not talking about theory. We're talking about facts." Burke raised an eyebrow, but his calm demeanor faltered slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Samantha stepped closer, holding up a piece of paper. "You left your DNA at the Hill house, Mr. Burke. It's all over Maria's body. I don't need to explain what that means." Burke's face drained of color. His eyes widened for a split second before he regained control, but Samantha had already seen enough. She could tell that he was unraveling. "I didn't." Burke started, but his voice trailed off as he realized the game was up. He swallowed hard, his lips trembling. "You don't understand. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. It wasn't supposed to be like this." Samantha took a step back, her voice steady but firm. "Tell me everything, Burke. Tell me what happened." For a long moment there was silence. Samantha could feel his hesitation, his internal struggle to come clean. But finally Burke spoke, his voice low and shaky. "Harold. Harold wasn't just hiding a secret from his wife," Burke began. "He was hiding his entire life. He told her that he was a man, a real man, but he wasn't. He had to keep that from her, and I helped him do it." Samantha's mind raced, piecing together the fragmented information. She had suspected it, Harold's transgender identity, but hearing it from David Burke was another thing entirely. "Harold was living a lie," Burke continued, his voice growing quieter. "Maria had started to catch on. She had seen things, heard things, and she was getting too close. She was going to expose him. I knew what would happen if she did. Harold would lose everything. So I helped him. I was there that night. When Maria confronted him, when she found out the truth, we panicked. We didn't know what to do. And I don't know how it happened, but it all went wrong. I didn't want her to die. But Harold, he lost it. He shot her." Samantha's stomach churned. She had known Harold was capable of great lengths to protect his secret, but this was beyond anything she had anticipated. Burke had been an accomplice in a cover-up, but Harold had pulled the trigger. "And you stayed there with the body?" Samantha asked, her voice tinged with disgust. Burke nodded slowly. "We had to make it look like something else. Harold was so scared. He didn't know how to cover it up properly, but I told him we could make it look like a robbery gone wrong. We just had to keep the body in place long enough for the scene to be believable." Samantha felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine as she processed the confession. This wasn't just a case of a murder gone wrong. This was a carefully orchestrated plan, a plan that had been executed by two men who were desperate to protect their secrets at any cost. Samantha stood in the dimly lit apartment, the weight of Burke's words hanging heavy in the air. This case was more than just a tragedy. It was a story of deception, betrayal, and fear. Fear of being exposed for who they really were. But the truth was now out, and there would be no more hiding. Samantha turned toward the door. "You're under arrest, David Burke," she said, her voice steady, "for the murder of Maria Hill and for your part in covering it up." As she cuffed him and led him out of the apartment, Samantha felt a sense of closure, though it was bittersweet. Maria Hill's life had been stolen by the people she trusted the most, but now at least she would get the justice she deserved. The days that followed David Burke's arrest felt like a blur to Detective Samantha Carter. The entire town of Ravenwood seemed to be in shock. No one had expected the dark truth about Harold Hill and his deadly secrets to come to light in such a brutal and public way. The whispers of betrayal, lies, and murder had spread through the community like wildfire, and as much as Samantha had hoped that justice would bring some sense of closure, the pain and shock were palpable in every corner of the town. Samantha sat in her office, surrounded by piles of case files and police reports, her mind still reeling from the complexity of the case. Burke's confession had been damning, but she knew that there was still more to uncover, especially when it came to Harold Hill. Burke had played a role, but it was Harold who had pulled the trigger. It was Harold who had ultimately ended his wife's life to protect a secret that he could never fully accept. As she reviewed the evidence again, her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. She picked it up, seeing the name of the lead prosecutor, Carla Moore, on the screen. "Detective Carter," Carla said, her voice sharp and professional. "We need to talk about Harold Hill." Samantha leaned forward, the familiar sensation of tension in her chest returning. "What's going on?" "We've got him in custody," Carla said. "We just finished questioning him and he's not talking much. But we did manage to get one thing out of him. Harold is willing to plead guilty to second-degree murder." Samantha's heart sank. It wasn't the confession she was hoping for. "What do you mean? He's admitting to it?" "Not directly," Carla replied. "He's not giving us a full account of the events, but he's willing to take a plea deal. He'll plead guilty, but he's insisting that David Burke is the one who pushed him to do it, that it was Burke who made him kill Maria." Samantha shook her head in frustration. She had known that Harold wouldn't come clean easily, but this was the last thing she expected. It was typical of someone like him, someone who had spent his whole life hiding the truth. But she wasn't going to let him rewrite the narrative now. "That's not going to fly," Samantha said, her voice firm. "We've got the evidence, Carla. Burke's DNA was on Maria's body, and he's already confessed. Harold was the one who killed her. We can't let him twist this into something else." "I agree," Carla said, her voice sympathetic. "But we're going to need more from him if we want to secure a conviction. He's playing hardball, and he's not going to give us anything unless we push him." Samantha leaned back in her chair, thinking. It was true that Harold had been adamant about his innocence in the days following Maria's murder, but now that Burke had confessed, Harold's story didn't hold water anymore. The truth was out, and it was time for Harold Hill to face the consequences of his actions. "Let me talk to him," Samantha said, her voice filled with resolve. "I'll get the truth out of him." The following afternoon, Samantha found herself standing in the cold, sterile interrogation room at the Ravenwood Police Department. She had done this 100 times before, confronting suspects, laying out the evidence, and waiting for them to crack. But something about this case felt different. Harold Hill was no ordinary man. He was a judge, a respected member of the community, and a man who had spent years hiding a secret that, once revealed, had shattered his entire life. Samantha waited for a few moments before the door opened, and Harold was escorted in by a pair of officers. He was still wearing the same suit he had been arrested in, a dark gray suit that looked too stiff for a man who had just lost everything. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from the sleepless nights he had spent in custody. Samantha stood up as Harold was seated across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Samantha could feel the weight of the moment. This was the final confrontation. This was where everything would either come crashing down or fall apart. Harold shifted in his seat, his hands trembling slightly as he folded them in front of him.